The elevator ride that never ends. Nina, a corporate worker, enters an elevator late at night in her office building. She presses the button for the ground floor, but the elevator descends into darkness instead. Each time the doors open, she's back at the same floor, only the hallway grows increasingly decayed. Shadows with glowing eyes start to appear, whispering her name. Nina tries different buttons, but every attempt makes the shadows more aggressive. Eventually, she meets a version of herself, decayed and screaming for help. The story ends with Nina realizing she's been in the elevator for years, doomed to relive the same torment. The story builds suspense through vivid descriptions of the decayed hallways and Nina's growing desperation, with each failed attempt to escape revealing a new layer of horror. Nina's experience begins innocently enough. She's the last one working late, determined to finish a report. When the elevator first malfunctions, she chalks it up to an old system. The sense of dread grows subtly, with the faintest whispers, odd glitches in the lights, and the air turning colder. Each loop introduces a new clue. Graffiti on the walls she swears wasn't there before, distorted music playing faintly through the intercom, and her phone showing scrambled, terrifying images instead of the time. As the loops progress, she realizes she isn't alone. Other shadowy entities are trapped with her, each representing someone who once rode this elevator and never escaped. The climax builds to Nina's horrifying encounter with her future self, screaming in an endless cycle, revealing her ultimate fate. The endless funeral. Tom attends the funeral of his estranged father in his hometown. As he steps into the funeral home, he notices strange things, faces he doesn't recognize, whispers that grow louder. When the ceremony ends, he finds himself outside, only to realize the day has reset. Each loop reveals darker secrets about his father's past and the family's hidden curse. As the loops continue, Tom notices the corpse in the casket begins to decay further, even moving. The horrifying twist comes when he opens the casket in one loop, only to find himself lying inside, screaming for freedom. Tom's journey starts with an awkward reunion with relatives he barely knows, who seem overly interested in his presence. Subtle hints of the loop, like the same sequence of conversations or the same fly landing on his hand, begin to gnaw at his mind. As Tom confronts the funeral's eerie regularity, he starts investigating his father's past, discovering cryptic letters and unsettling photos. Each loop allows him to learn more about a ritual involving sacrifices to prolong the family's legacy, and his father's death was only the beginning. The climax intensifies as Tom realizes he's the next sacrifice, his body slowly replacing the corpse in the casket, sealing his fate in the curse. The road that eats time. Jenny and her boyfriend Mark had been on the road for hours, returning home after a weekend getaway. The night sky was clear, and the road stretched endlessly in front of them, flanked by dense forests on both sides. Their conversation was light-hearted, filled with laughter and shared memories, when the car suddenly sputtered. The engine made a choking sound before giving out entirely. Jenny glanced at Mark with a nervous smile. "Well, that's not good," she muttered. Mark tried the ignition again, but it was no use. The headlights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light the empty road. "Great," Mark sighed, stepping out of the car. "Let me check under the hood." Jenny stayed inside, scrolling through her phone, only to realize there was no signal. A knot of unease settled in her stomach as she looked out into the silent, still forest. When Mark returned, his expression was grim. "It's not starting. There's a gas station a few miles back. Maybe we can walk there." Reluctantly, they left the car and started down the road, the cool night air nipping at their skin. At first, the silence felt peaceful, the rhythmic crunch of gravel under their shoes almost soothing. But as they walked, Jenny began to feel like something was off. "Does this road look different to you?" she asked, glancing around. Mark shrugged. "It's just dark. Everything looks weird at night." But Jenny couldn't shake the feeling. The trees seemed closer than before, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above, once bright, began to fade one by one, until the sky was an empty void. After what felt like an hour, they stopped. "We should have seen the gas station by now," Jenny said, her voice tinged with panic. Mark looked around, frowning. "Let's go a bit further. Maybe we misjudged the distance." They walked in silence, the oppressive stillness growing heavier with every step. Finally, they saw a familiar shape in the distance. Relief flooded through Jenny, until she realized it was their car. This can't be right," she stammered. Mark frowned. "Maybe we got turned around." Jenny shook her head. She was certain they had walked in a straight line. Yet here they were, back where they started. As they stood by the car, trying to make sense of the situation, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road and trees. The air grew colder, and Jenny could feel her unease turning into full-blown fear. "We'll try again," Mark said firmly, though his voice wavered. They set off once more, this time in a tense silence. But no matter how far they walked, they always ended up back at the car. And each time, the road seemed darker, the trees more menacing. The fog grew thicker, and strange shapes moved at the edge of their vision, shadowy figures lurking among the trees. Jenny's phone was no help. The screen flickered with static, and the time never changed. Mark's phone was equally useless. "This is insane," Jenny whispered. Mark's face was pale, his usual confidence replaced with a growing fear. But something else began to bother Jenny. With each loop, Mark seemed different. He spoke less, his responses growing vague and detached. His eyes looked distant, almost empty, and his movements became stiff, unnatural. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to her with a blank expression. "I'm fine, let's just keep walking." But Jenny wasn't convinced. As they walked, she noticed subtle changes in his appearance. His features seemed to blur, as though they were losing definition. His voice became flatter, almost robotic. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Mark was forgetting her. With each loop, he seemed to lose pieces of himself, pieces of their shared memories. "Mark, it's me, Jenny. Do you remember me?" she pleaded. He blinked at her, confused. "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" But his tone lacked conviction. In the next loop, the shadows in the trees began to take shape. Jenny could see them more clearly now. Tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. And among them, she saw a face she recognized, Mark's. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice shaking. She grabbed Mark's arm, but his skin felt cold, almost lifeless. He pulled away from her without a word, his gaze fixed on the figures in the trees. "Mark, don't!" she cried, but he stepped into the fog, disappearing among the shadows. Jenny was alone now, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran back to the car, hoping it would somehow offer her safety. But when she looked into the rearview mirror, she froze. Her reflection was fading. Her features were blurring, just like Mark's had. Her face, her identity, was slipping away. The figures in the trees began to close in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Jenny realized the truth. She was becoming one of them. Her last thought before the darkness consumed her was of Mark's face, now unrecognizable among the shadows, and the endless road that would forever lead her back to the same inescapable fate. Dinner at the haunted diner. The car buzzed with laughter and music as the group of 5 friends sped down the deserted highway. The road trip had been a last-minute plan, a way to escape the monotony of life and rekindle old bonds. Mia, the designated driver, pointed out the neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. "Betty's Diner," she read aloud. "Classic name. Who's hungry?" "I could eat," Greg said, leaning forward from the back seat. He smirked at Ethan, who was scrolling through his phone. "You're not going to find anything better out here." "Yeah, unless you want to eat tumbleweeds," added Sophie, nudging Ethan. Reluctantly, Ethan pocketed his phone. "Fine. Let's see what Betty's has to offer." The diner looked like a time capsule from the 1950s. Its chrome exterior gleamed under the flickering neon sign, and the soft glow of the interior lights hinted at red booths and a long counter. The group piled out of the car, joking about retro jukeboxes and milkshakes. Inside, the diner was almost too perfect. The checkered floors shone, and the smell of coffee mingled with something vaguely sweet. A cheerful waitress in a starched uniform approached. "Evening, folks," she said, her red lipstick vibrant against her pale skin. "Take a seat anywhere." The friends slid into a booth, the vinyl creaking under their weight. The waitress handed out laminated menus. "Betty's special pancakes," Mia read. "Doesn't that sound oddly specific?" "It's probably just pancakes," Greg said. "Relax." As they chatted and placed their orders, Sophie noticed a small detail that made her pause. "Hey, is that clock?" "Ticking backward," Ethan finished, staring at it. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Mia laughed it off. "It's just a gimmick, you know, retro charm or whatever." The waitress returned with their food. Plates were heaped with steaming burgers, fries, and pancakes. As they dug into their meals, the initial bites were met with approval, the flavors rich and nostalgic. Greg laughed mid-chew, recounting a story from their college days, but paused, frowning at his burger. "Is it just me, or does this taste off?" Sophie wrinkled her nose at her fries, holding one up to the light. "Yeah, these taste weirdly sweet, like they're coated in syrup or something." Ethan pushed his plate away, his face pale. "My pancakes, they smell like mildew." Mia tried to brush it off, teasing them about being picky eaters, but when she took another bite, her expression faltered. The group exchanged uneasy glances, and as the conversation waned, the faint sound of a jukebox filled the air, playing the same old song on repeat. The waitress hovered nearby, her hollow smile unchanging as her gaze lingered too long. They decided to leave, laughing nervously about their overly critical taste buds, but as they stepped outside, the warm night air felt oddly stale, the highway gone, replaced by a stretch of darkness. "What the hell?" Greg muttered as they turned back, finding the diner's neon sign glowing brighter, the door swinging open as if inviting them in. Against their better judgment, they stepped inside again, and their booth awaited, plates refilled with identical meals. The unease grew sharper with every loop. Each time they tried to leave, they found themselves re-entering the diner, the food slightly more grotesque. Burgers oozed blackened grease, fries twisted into gnarled shapes, and the pancakes took on a sickly green hue. The other patrons, initially unremarkable, now watched them with unnerving stillness, their hollow eyes reflecting an inhuman hunger. Mia tried calling for help, but her phone displayed static, the battery draining inexplicably. As panic set in, the group's humor dissolved into frayed tempers and hushed arguments. On the fourth loop, Greg was gone, his seat empty, the waitress claiming he had never been there. The friends searched frantically, their calls echoing in the diner's strange acoustics, but no one responded except for the other patrons, who began to grin wide and unnatural. The food arrived again, more grotesque than ever. And as Ethan hesitantly poked at his plate, he uncovered a fragment of something horrifyingly familiar. A piece of Greg's watch, glinting beneath a mound of decaying fries. The realization hit like a tidal wave, and Sophie screamed, shoving her plate away as the food writhed as if alive. The group tried to flee once more, but the walls of the diner seemed to stretch, the exit impossibly far. The waitress appeared, her cheerful demeanor slipping to reveal a gaunt, monstrous face. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered with echoes. "Not until you've finished your meal." Mia, Sophie and Ethan fought against the growing terror, but one by one they began to succumb. Mia disappearing into the shadows between loops. Sophie falling silent as she stared blankly at her untouched plate. Ethan, now alone, stumbled upon the truth scrawled in blood-red letters on a backroom wall. "Eat and be consumed." His friends' faces stared back at him from the grotesque meals, their mouths silently pleading for release. The jukebox blared louder, the song a discordant hymn, as Ethan was dragged to his seat by the grinning patrons. In the final loop, a new group of travelers entered the diner, laughing and chatting as they took in the nostalgic charm. The waitress greeted them warmly, her hollow eyes flickering with hunger. At a booth in the corner, 3 new meals were being prepared, their faint whispers drowned out by the ticking clock and the endless, inescapable tune. The Clockmaker's Curse. Elliot buys an antique clock from a mysterious shop, hoping to fix his failing marriage. The clock seems to reset time every midnight, but only for him. At first, he uses it to correct mistakes, but the loops grow darker. His wife starts acting strangely, staring at him without blinking. Each reset brings him closer to discovering the truth. The clock is feeding on his life. The horrifying climax reveals that Elliot's real body is in the clockmaker's shop, decaying while his soul is trapped in the endless loops. Elliot's story begins with relatable struggles, his desire to salvage his marriage, making him a sympathetic character. The clock initially seems like a miracle, allowing him to avoid arguments and rekindle moments of love. However, the growing darkness manifests in chilling details. His wife's reflection in mirrors doesn't match her movements, and the clock's ticking grows louder, almost like a heartbeat. The final revelation, a haunting encounter with his decayed body in the clockmaker's shop, cements the horror of his eternal entrapment. The hospital's hallways. Rachel wakes up in a hospital bed, unable to remember how she got there. The nurses act friendly, but seem to dodge her questions. She tries to leave, only to find the hallways never end. Each door she opens leads her back to her room, but the hospital grows darker with every loop. Patients with grotesque, monstrous features start appearing, whispering secrets about her death. Rachel realizes she's a ghost trapped in purgatory, reliving her final moments in the hospital, where she died in an accident. The story ends with Rachel screaming as she's pulled back into the loop yet again. Rachel's story begins with disorientation, her struggle to remember creating a relatable tension. The hospital's friendly facade crumbles as small details, like the ticking of a broken clock and the absence of windows, unveil its sinister nature. The grotesque patients represent fragments of Rachel's own trauma, and their cryptic warnings build suspense. The climax, Rachel's realization of her ghostly state, is both tragic and terrifying, as she's forced to relive her demise without escape.